Hello, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant. Today I'm going to be covering this book, Hawk's Rest, a season in the remote heart of Yellowstone, written by Gary Ferguson. The cover image is cited on the back cover. The design is by Melissa Ferris. The National Geologic Survey image collection map by U.S. Geological Survey, Goshawk photo by Michael S. Quinton. Gary Ferguson was a former Forest Service ranger and has written more than a dozen books on nature and science. Spirits of the Wild was selected by the New York City Public Library as one of the best books of 1996. Ferguson's essays can be heard on National Public Radio. I purchased this book for $5. I don't know where. This book was published by the National Geographic Society in 2003. And this is one of those early copies. It's an interesting book. He opens it with this line. Poet Jane Hirshfield once remarked that when it came to personal callings, hers was best described as a struggle to match her life to a suitable landscape. Just my luck, I guess, that my own hankerings would lead me to a slice of high country roosting on a latitude halfway to the North Pole. In a town where kids hunt Easter eggs in drifts of snow, where girls head off to senior prom bedecked in strapless dresses and sorrel boots. Yet what summer in these mountains lacks in duration, it makes up for in heart, as bright and full of twitch as a young boy's dreams. Evidence of what over a century ago author Helen Hunt Jackson, also writing about summer in the Rockies, described as the great and tender law of compensation. For 10 glorious weeks, 11 in a good year, the days are wrapped in the kind of warmth that pops leaves and melts snow, that by some fine and murky sleight of hand manages to soften time itself. He has a really great voice in this book. It's not just that poetic style of writing, though. He also does include some contemporary events that are relevant to the area he stays. For example, in the middle of the book, he discusses the part of Yellowstone that he's spending the summer in, which is called the Thoroughfare. Specifically, how one seasonal ranger who had been there for 25 years went on a crusade against salt block placement. This issue by which a hunter or a guide company goes out and leaves salt licks just off of park property to pull elk from within Yellowstone National Park outside of the park so that they can be more easily hunted in the sparser forest off park. And it is specifically a symptom of changing times. As he describes, in the 1980s, sport hunting in the area changed from going into the wilderness for a week and potentially getting an elk to going into the wilderness to kill an elk. In the past, there was an outdoorsman spirit to it, that they're going out to the wilderness and they may not necessarily get that elk, but they're going to have a great time feeling rugged and feeling as if they're part of that wilderness. But in the 80s and early 90s, times were changing. A lot of the businesses were buying out the smaller businesses, and a lot of out-of-state investors were buying businesses as well. And a lot of these out-of-state investors had one thing in mind: results. And to guarantee results, the hunters needed to make sure that elk would come out of the forest to a place where they could be hunted. And so salt licks were a way to guarantee that elk would be in the area, and it kind of had a trickle-down effect. As he describes, with more elk being killed on these hunts, there were more trophies as the customers were interested in, but the guts and the gore that was left behind would be eaten by grizzlies. And because grizzlies were not as protected in Wyoming, it also meant that people could hunt grizzlies there as well, or kill grizzlies and get by without punishment. And so it's a book concerned with the way humanity is affecting this very wild portion of Yellowstone National Park and Wyoming's wilderness in general. Salting is illegal in the part of Wyoming just off of Yellowstone National Park because it is part of a wilderness area, a land designation I have discussed in other videos on this channel. Honestly, wilderness areas are probably my favorite designation of public land. Even more so than national parks, national wilderness areas are an opportunity for America to treat wilderness as wilderness. There are some issues in that it is managed, and this means that some areas aren't really managed properly. In our recent history, fires have been allowed to spread so that they can go back to a more natural flow of nourishing the earth. But decades of mismanagement of fires have left a lot of detritus and fuel at ground level. So fires need to be managed so that they don't go out of control, or that they don't kill the nutrients, the bacteria in the soil. If they do, then nothing grows there for an extended period of time, and it just erodes away, washing away dirt that then ends up downstream and changes the river environments as well. And in the case of Yellowstone National Park, that's the Missouri River, which is one of the bigger rivers in the United States. Part of this problem is exacerbated by hunters' interest groups in Wyoming who would rather cater to wealthy customers from out of state rather than enforce the National Wilderness Act. On page 106, this is put very succinctly. In a chronic case of doublespeak, Bridger Teton Forest Supervisor Brian Stout acknowledged in a letter of August 1988 that the Wilderness Act prohibits direct control of wildlife, but went on to claim that salting to encourage elk redistribution is not control. And besides, Stout maintained, elk aren't hunted directly over the salt blocks themselves, but rather the salt was merely to better distribute the animals, thereby providing a quality wilderness recreation experience for hunters. Reading on and largely between the lines, it appears that Stout was leaning on the old theory that elk are absent from the forest because of mineral deficiencies in the soil, that by providing salt, the outfitters were correcting a deficiency of the land itself. The only problem is that at the time, outfitters weren't using mineral blocks at all, but plain old salt. And so he goes on to describe multiple people that were personally invested in making public the use of salt licks and why that was a problem for the ecosystem. America has a soft spot for Yellowstone National Park, especially visible in the way we treat it in popular media, with so many shows and movies on set in that part of the country, and even the cartoons we watch, Yogi Bear and Jellystone National Park. And so any movement is more likely to gain traction especially an environmental movement, is likely to gain traction if it affects Yellowstone National Park. And this was clear in the way wolf reintroduction was able to get firm roots and foundations by using Yellowstone National Park as a testing ground. And Yellowstone National Park is used to prevent mining claims in Wyoming and Montana that would flow downstream into the Yellowstone River. It is where bison, an iconic national symbol, were allowed to repopulate a pretty big swath of land and kind of restore the environment. And so salt licks probably got some attention, maybe not as much as it could have gotten, but it was able to circulate in some news because Yellowstone National Park holds a grip on our hearts. And this book goes on. It's not just pessimistic. It's not just reporting on those issues. It is a summer this guy spends talking to the people that love the thoroughfare and want it to be as beautiful and resourceful as possible. But the word resourceful can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. And to hunters and hunting outfits, it means that there's plenty of game that can be brought off the park and into a place where they can be shot. It's a place where they can bring out of state customers to show them a beautiful countryside. But it's also resourceful to the people that love wilderness for the sake of wilderness, people that want to go out there and just breathe pristine and clean air and live for however short a period of time in a land that is as unmarred by human hands as you can get in the continental 48. And so it's a very interesting book that tugs at the heartstrings of any environmentalist and any wilderness lover. I'm a desert rat myself, and even though Yellowstone is a very different environment, this book makes me want to be there long term. So it's a very interesting book. It's not long. It's only about 215 pages of content. But if you want a book about Yellowstone and a part of Yellowstone that you might not necessarily see all the time, this is a good book for you. I've only read this a couple of times, but it's really, really good. And I think if you find it new, it's probably worth it. I bought this, like I said earlier, for $5, and it has definitely been worth it. If you see it in a used bookstore, buy it. If you see it elsewhere, consider it. But it is, 20 years old now, and so some of the topics are a bit dated, but still conservation movements are always contemporary, always modern, always something that needs investment. And if this encourages you to invest, all the better. My name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant.